What if I told you that the greatest pitching performance in the history of Major League Baseball wasn't driven by confidence, wasn't driven by natural talent, and wasn't even driven by love for the game? What if the man behind that historic 1988 season, the one who set a record so untouchable it still stands today, was running from a fear so deep he couldn't even name it? What if the legend everyone celebrated was quietly breaking apart at the exact same moment the world was applauding him? Here's what nobody told you about Orel Hershiser. He wasn't supposed to be great. Nobody looked at him and saw a future icon. Nobody handed him anything. He was the kid in the back of every lineup, the name nobody called first, the player coaches looked past without blinking. And yet, on October 20th, 1988, he stood at the center of the baseball universe, holding the World Series MVP trophy, having just delivered one of the most dominant postseason runs any pitcher has ever had. The story sounds like a miracle. But what happened behind that story, the physical collapse, the psychological war, the silent suffering that lasted decades after the lights went out, that is what we're talking about today. And I promise you, you've never heard it told like this. Let's go back to the very beginning, because the real story of Orel Hershiser doesn't start in 1988. It doesn't start in a Dodger stadium packed with 56,000 screaming fans. It starts in Ohio, in the kind of ordinary that most people never escape. He wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't the kid who made coaches stop and stare. He was invisible in the exact kind of way that leaves a mark on you, the kind of invisible that says quietly, without anyone needing to speak the words, that you're not quite enough. In those early years on the baseball field, while other kids were being flagged for their speed, or their arm strength, or that natural effortless ability that some people just seem to be born with, Orel was the one repeating drills, doing it again, staying longer, trying harder just to hold his position in the back of the pack. There was no applause for that. No coach pulling him aside to say, "Hey, I see something in you." What he got instead was silence. And silence, when you're a young kid trying to prove your worth, can be louder than any criticism. That silence started to become something inside him. Not rage, not bitterness, just a quiet, persistent crack in his sense of self. A voice that asked the same question over and over. Am I really good enough? And the painful part wasn't that other kids said no. It was that nobody said yes either. When you're surrounded by people who seem to advance naturally, who seem to improve without trying twice as hard as you start to believe the problem is permanent. You start to believe that the gap between you and them isn't something effort can close. And slowly, without realizing it, Orel stopped dreaming the way other kids dreamed. He stopped picturing himself at the top. He started aiming for something far smaller and far sadder. Just not being last. Just not falling behind so far that he disappeared completely. And here's what makes that so shocking when you look at where he ended up. Because that shrinking, that quiet retreat from ambition, didn't stop him from becoming great. It actually became the engine that got him there. The less he was recognized, the harder he worked. The more he felt overlooked, the more obsessively persistent he became. He didn't know it yet, but every afternoon he stayed on that field after everyone else had left, throwing pitch after pitch into empty air with nobody watching, nobody keeping score, nobody caring. He was building something. Not talent, not natural ability, something far rarer. He was building a will that didn't need an audience. And when he arrived at Bowling Green State University, nothing had changed on the surface. He still wasn't the guy people pointed to. He still wasn't the one scouts drove across state lines to see. While his teammates showed off the speed, the power, the mechanics that turned heads, Orel kept doing what he always did. Working quietly, enduring patiently, surviving. But college brought a new and painful clarity, because at this level, everyone was good. Everyone had been the best player where they came from. Everyone had something. And so the differences between who was naturally gifted and who wasn't became impossible to ignore. Orel couldn't dominate with raw talent. He never had that weapon. What he had was the ability to avoid mistakes. And so that became his entire strategy, not to win spectacularly, but to not lose his spot. In his head, there was no voice pushing him toward greatness. There was only a whisper. Don't fail. Just don't fail. And that whisper, quiet as it was, turned into a philosophy. It forced him to become obsessively precise, to learn the game at a level most players never bother with, to understand every small variable, every decision point, every fraction of a moment where a mistake could mean being replaced. He didn't build himself into a pitcher because he loved the craft. He built himself into a pitcher because the fear of disappearing was stronger than anything else he felt. But there was a cost to that, and it was a cost he wouldn't fully understand for years. Because when your entire existence on a baseball field is oriented around not failing, you quietly surrender your right to do something extraordinary. You can't risk what you might lose. You can't swing for something spectacular when all your energy is directed at protecting the little you have. And Orel, even in those college years, had started building a career on a foundation that was simultaneously his greatest strength, and a trap he wouldn't see until it was closing around him. A foundation of fear turned into discipline, of insecurity turned into precision, of obsession with not being good enough transformed, over years, into something that looked from the outside like mastery. But it wasn't mastery. Not yet. It was survival in a very expensive disguise. When the MLB draft finally came, and his name was called, it wasn't a moment of triumph. He wasn't a top pick. He wasn't a celebrated prospect. He was a modest selection, the kind teams make with cautious hope and low expectations. And if you didn't know anything about what would come next, you might have looked at that moment and thought, well, at least he gets a shot. But Orel looked at it differently. He heard confirmation of what he'd always believed, that he was going to have to fight for every single thing he got, that nothing would ever be given, that his place in any room was always provisional, always temporary, always one bad day away from being taken back. And so he went into professional baseball carrying the same fear he'd carried since childhood, only now the stakes were higher. Now the field was bigger, and the competition was sharper, and the consequences of failure were more real than they'd ever been before. The minor leagues are where most baseball dreams quietly die. Not in a dramatic way. Not with a memorable collapse that becomes a story people tell. They die in the monotony. In the endless bus rides between cities you've never heard of. In the makeshift hotel rooms and the sparse crowds where the crack of a ball hitting a glove echoes louder than any applause. In the mornings where you wake up in a strange city and realize no one outside this building knows your name, and the people inside don't particularly care about you either. Orel lived in that world for years. And what made it so psychologically brutal wasn't the difficulty. He was used to difficulty. It was the absence of any signal that the difficulty was leading somewhere. There were no signs, no encouragement, no coach pulling him aside to say, keep going, something is about to break open for you. There was just the grind day after day, with nothing to show for it. And he kept going, not because he was sure it would work, not because some inner fire of ambition kept him warm. He kept going because he didn't know how to stop, because stopping meant admitting that every year he'd already spent was pointless. And that was the one thing he couldn't bring himself to accept. It was stubbornness in its rawest form, the most unromantic version of perseverance imaginable. No inspiration, no hope, just an inability to quit. And then, finally, a door opened. Not a grand door with a welcome party on the other side. A door that looked almost exactly like another test. When Orel Hershiser was called up to the Los Angeles Dodgers, stepping into the major leagues for the first time, he didn't feel like he'd arrived. He felt like the exam had gotten harder. Because in the big leagues, every mistake is magnified. Every bad game isn't just a bad game. It's evidence. It's material for the argument that you don't belong here. It's the reason someone more talented gets your spot. And Orel, who had spent his entire life feeling like his spot could be taken at any moment, stepped into that environment and immediately felt the full weight of it. He didn't pitch to dominate. He pitched to survive. Every appearance was one long, grinding exercise in not handing anyone a reason to send him back down. Don't fail. The whisper from college had followed him all the way to Los Angeles. But something started to shift. Not overnight, not dramatically, but with the slow, grinding kind of consistency that people don't notice until it's already happened. He began to prove himself. Not by being spectacular. Not by being the pitcher who made hitters afraid when he walked to the mound. But by being the one coaches could trust. The one who wouldn't panic in the late innings. The one you handed the ball to in the tight spots not because he was the most gifted, but because he'd make fewer mistakes than anyone else on the staff. And paradoxically, that trust became the heaviest thing he'd ever carried. Because trust, at the major league level, isn't a compliment. It's an obligation. And obligations don't allow failure. When you're the reliable one, you're no longer pitching for yourself. You're pitching for everyone who's placed faith in you. And faith, as Orel was learning, doesn't extend grace for bad days. Every time he stepped on that mound now, he wasn't carrying a baseball. He was carrying an entire system's belief that he would not break down. And that expectation, while it looked gentler than what he'd faced before, was its own kind of cruelty. So he became more precise, more controlled, more mechanical. He stripped out every element of risk, every impulse to try something bold, every moment where he might have let himself experiment or be imperfect. Because imperfection at this level meant doubt, and doubt meant the beginning of the end. He couldn't afford that. And what he didn't realize, couldn't have realized at the time, was that the very precision he was building, the exact quality that was keeping him alive in this system, was slowly becoming an invisible cage. He couldn't get worse, but he also couldn't change. He couldn't evolve. He couldn't try to become something different, because different meant risk. And risk was the thing his entire psychology had been built to avoid since that Ohio field where nobody clapped. And so, while the world began to see a steady, dependable, intelligent pitcher, inside Orel Hershiser was a man beginning to wonder, if all I do is avoid mistakes, am I actually living, or am I just surviving in a more prestigious location than before? And then 1988 arrived, and it swept every one of those quiet questions off the table. The 1988 season was something that defies normal baseball language. It wasn't just a great year. It was one of those rare athletic performances that steps outside the normal spectrum of what humans do and sits in a category almost entirely by itself. 59 consecutive scoreless innings. Let that number land for a second. 59 innings without allowing a single run. That's nearly 7 full games of complete shutout pitching in a row, at the highest level of professional baseball, in a pennant race, with everything on the line. It won him the Cy Young Award. It made him the undisputed best pitcher in the National League. And then the postseason arrived, and he kept going. He was the backbone of the Dodgers' run through the NLCS. He was the man they turned to when everything was on the edge. And when the World Series came against the Oakland Athletics, one of the most dominant teams assembled in that era, Orel Hershiser stood at the center and delivered. World Series MVP. The whole thing. The complete story. From the kid nobody believed in to the man holding every honor the sport could offer. America saw a miracle. But what was actually happening inside his body during those 59 innings, during those playoff games, during that World Series run, was something the cameras never showed. Every single pitch in that streak was doing damage. Not the kind of damage you feel in the moment. Not the sharp, obvious pain that makes you stop and say, something is wrong. The quiet kind. The cumulative kind. The kind that builds so slowly, pitch by pitch, inning by inning, game by game, that you can almost convince yourself it isn't there. His shoulder and his arm were being stretched beyond what a human body is designed to handle over a sustained period. And the worst part, the truly shocking part of this story, is that Orel knew. He could feel the signals. He could feel the fatigue building in a way that didn't respond to rest the way it used to. But what was he supposed to do? Stop. Walk off the mound in the middle of a World Series and tell Tommy Lasorda, "I need a few months?" The system had no framework for that conversation. The image he'd built had no room for that kind of honesty. And so he kept going. Because that was what you did. Because that was what he'd always done. And because deep down, he still couldn't shake the fear that if he showed weakness, even once, everything he'd built would collapse around him. The perfect machine performed flawlessly for the cameras. But the machine was being pushed well past its intended operating limit. And that bill would come due. Oh, it would absolutely come due. When 1988 ended, the world took a photograph in their minds and labeled it Orel Hershiser. That photograph showed a Cy Young winner, a World Series champion, a pitcher of historic precision and poise. And from that moment forward, every time he stepped onto a mound again, he was being compared to that photograph. Not explicitly, not cruelly, just constantly, inevitably, silently, and without mercy. The world didn't demand that he repeat the impossible, but the world expected him to be the man from that photograph. And that man, that 1988 version of Orel Hershiser, was already beginning to recede. His body, having given everything it had during that season, was not recovering the way it should. The pitches in 1989 weren't as sharp. The edge wasn't the same. He could still perform, still compete, still win games. But inside, he felt the difference with every single pitch. Something had shifted. Something had been used up that wasn't coming back. And the cruelest part of this was that he couldn't tell anyone. He couldn't step forward and say, "I left too much on the field in 1988, and now I'm paying for it." Because the man from that photograph didn't say things like that. The man from that photograph was the standard. Not a person who suffered. A standard. And then 1990 arrived, and his body finally refused to keep the secret any longer. The shoulder that had delivered those 59 scoreless innings, that had pitched through the NLCS, that had won a World Series, finally broke down in a way that couldn't be hidden or managed or pitched through. The injury was serious. The diagnosis was unavoidable. Surgery was the only path forward. And in one swift, cold moment, the career of Orel Hershiser was interrupted in a way that shook him at a level that had nothing to do with the physical pain. Because Orel was a man who had built his entire psychological identity around control, around precision, around the ability to manage every variable, every element, every moment that might otherwise go wrong. And now his own body, the one tool he'd always been able to discipline and push and force to comply, was no longer under his control. That wasn't just a physical breakdown. That was an identity crisis. That was the foundation of who he believed himself to be, developing a crack he couldn't repair with extra practice, or more discipline, or longer hours in the bullpen. He was facing something he had never faced before, a limit he could not overcome, a wall he could not punch through. And in the silence of his recovery, the question he'd been running from his entire life came back, louder than it had ever been. If I cannot do this, then who am I? The recovery was long. It was full of the kind of uncertainty that a man like Orel Hershiser was completely unprepared for, because uncertainty had always been his enemy. He'd spent his career eliminating uncertainty, controlling every variable, making himself so reliable and so precise that uncertainty had no room to exist. But recovery from major shoulder surgery doesn't work that way. Some days you feel progress. Other days you feel like you've moved backward. Some mornings you wake up and the arm feels close to what it was. Other mornings you understand, with a clarity that sits in your chest like a stone, that maybe it will never be quite the same again. He had no mound to stand on, no pitches to throw, no rhythm to fall into, just silence, and a calendar, and a question he wasn't ready to answer. What if his best version was already gone? He came back. That part is documented. Orel Hershiser returned to the mound and continued pitching in the major leagues for years after that surgery. But what isn't fully captured in the record books is what it felt like on the inside of that return. Because the world greeted his comeback as a victory, as proof of resilience, as a story of triumph over adversity. And in one sense, it was all of those things. But from inside his own experience, the return was the beginning of a different kind of suffering. Because now he was competing on a mound against a version of himself that no longer existed. Every game, every inning, every pitch was happening in the shadow of 1988. Not because anyone was cruel enough to say it out loud, but because that was the context he lived in. That was his identity. That was the photograph the world had taken. And no matter what he did in the present tense, it was being measured against a past self he had no way to reach anymore. A good game wasn't a success. It was a question about whether it compared to what he used to do. A mistake wasn't just a mistake. It was evidence of what had been lost. Every moment on that mound was a confrontation between who he was now and who he had been. And who he had been was the 1988 version. Untouchable, historic, impossible to match. He changed his approach. He had to. His delivery evolved. His pitch selection adapted. He learned to get hitters out with less than he'd once had, with more strategy and fewer raw tools. And there's something remarkable about that, something worth acknowledging. The ability to reinvent yourself as an athlete after losing your peak physical ability is genuinely rare. Most players at that level either try to force the old approach until it completely fails, or they walk away. Orel did something harder. He rebuilt. He found a way to still compete. But that rebuilding, that constant adaptation, came with its own psychological toll, because every adjustment was a reminder of what had been taken. You don't need to find workarounds when you still have everything. You only need workarounds when something is gone. And he was reminded of what was gone with every pitch he threw. He would lie awake at night, not from physical pain alone, but from the replaying of every pitch, every decision, every moment where he'd fallen short of what he used to be. The mind doesn't stop when the game ends. Not for a person wired the way he was. Not for someone who had spent his entire career obsessing over every detail. The silent war continued long after the stadium lights went dark. And then eventually the career ended. Not with a tearful farewell game. Not with a ceremony and a standing ovation and a moment the crowd would remember. It ended the way most careers end at the professional level, quietly and practically, when the body could no longer keep pace with what the game demands. And the world moved on. That's the part of this story nobody talks about. Baseball continued. New pitchers emerged. New records were chased. New moments of brilliance gave fans new photographs to hold in their minds. The Los Angeles Dodgers kept playing, kept winning, kept losing, kept being the Dodgers. But this time, without Orel Hershiser on the roster. And the shocking, clarifying, almost unbearable truth of that moment was this. His absence changed nothing. The world didn't pause. It didn't slow down to acknowledge what had been lost. It just kept going, the way it always does, indifferent to individual exits, indifferent to the silence that fills the space where a person used to be. For a man who had devoted his entire identity to his place on that field, that indifference was devastating in a way that didn't show up in any box score. He went home, to family, to the quieter rhythms of a life not organized around seasons and rosters, and the pressure of a game that the whole country was watching. And on the surface, that transition looked like peace. A man who'd competed at the highest level finally getting to rest. Getting to be present with the people he loved in a way the grueling pace of professional baseball never allowed. But quiet doesn't mean healed. And rest doesn't mean resolved. Because the questions that sports had allowed him to avoid for 20 years, questions about identity, about worth, about what you are when you strip away what you do, those questions were still there, waiting patiently in the silence. He had to figure out, for the first time in his adult life, what he was worth when he wasn't performing, who he was when he wasn't proving anything to anyone, how to exist in a world that wasn't keeping score. That's not a simple transition. For most people, that's a slow and often painful renegotiation with themselves. And then the body entered its final chapter of the story. Because the body always gets the last word. In his 60s, the physical consequences of what he had put himself through in 1988, and through all those years of pitching through pain and injury and exhaustion began surfacing in ways he could no longer manage away. The shoulder that had set that record, that had carried an entire season and then a postseason on its own, had been living with the consequences of those pitches for decades. And now, with no games to play, no adrenaline to mask the fatigue, no focus to redirect his attention away from what his body was telling him, those consequences became part of daily life. Movements that were once simple required thought. Activity that should have been effortless required adjustment. Some mornings his body greeted him with a clarity he couldn't argue with. The past had not stayed in the past. It had settled into his joints, into the tissue, into the slow morning stiffness of a man who had asked more of his body than it was ever designed to give. And every ache was a memory. Every limitation was a receipt from a transaction made decades ago on a baseball diamond in front of tens of thousands of people who had no idea what it was costing him. Here's the thing about the price of greatness that nobody in the sports world wants to say out loud. It doesn't always get paid at the peak. Sometimes it gets deferred. Sometimes you pay it in the silent years after the crowd has gone home and the cameras have moved on to someone younger. Sometimes the body holds the bill quietly for 20, 30 years, and then presents it without warning when you're least prepared to receive it. Orel Hershiser paid that bill. He paid it in the mornings that required extra time, in the movements that required more care, in the quiet understanding that some choices he made at 34 years old in the greatest season of his life were choices his body at 65 would still be living inside. And what's remarkable, what elevates this story beyond the ordinary sports narrative of peak and decline, is what he did with that understanding. He didn't become bitter. He didn't spend his later years raging against the unfairness of a career that burned bright and then cost him so much in the years that followed. He accepted it. Not instantly, not easily, but genuinely. With the kind of acceptance that only becomes available to a person who has spent decades learning to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. Because that's what Orel Hershiser's story actually is at its core. It's not a story about baseball. It's a story about a man who spent his entire life running from the feeling of not being enough, and who discovered slowly, painfully, at enormous personal cost, that the drive that got him to the top was the same drive that was quietly breaking him apart on the way up. The fear never went away. It was always there, from the Ohio field where nobody clapped to the World Series mound to the long recovery rooms to the quiet mornings of retirement. The fear was constant. But what changed, what he learned over decades of carrying it, was how to live alongside it without letting it consume him. How to compete not because the fear demanded it, but because he'd chosen it. How to rest not because everything was resolved, but because the fight had simply taken a different form. The discipline remained. The humility remained. The endurance, that most underrated and undervalued quality in professional athletics, remained. And those things, the qualities that never made the highlight reel, became the truest measure of who he was. When people think about Orel Hershiser today, they think about 59 scoreless innings. They think about the 1988 Cy Young Award. They think about the World Series. They remember a pitcher of extraordinary calm and precision who seemed to operate on a different frequency than anyone around him. And all of that is real. All of that happened. But what didn't make the highlight reel was the boy who felt invisible in Ohio. The minor leaguer grinding through seasons nobody watched. The pitcher hiding pain during the greatest stretch of his career. The man in recovery, facing an identity crisis nobody could see on a physical exam. The retired athlete relearning what it meant to exist without a mound to stand on. The older man waking up to a body that carries the receipts from a career that asked everything of it. That's the real story. And it's not a tragedy. Not exactly. Because the man who endured all of that, who carried all of that, didn't collapse. He didn't fall apart. He didn't become someone smaller or more bitter or less worthy of the name people remembered. He kept going, quietly, steadily, with the same stubborn refusal to quit that had carried him from Ohio to Dodger Stadium and every difficult place in between. Greatness, when you look at it honestly, is never just about what happens in the spotlight. It's about what happens in all the places the spotlight doesn't reach. It's about what you do when no one is watching, what you carry when no one is helping you carry it, and who you remain when everything that defined you has been taken away. Orel Hershiser didn't need the world's validation to keep going. He never had it, not really, not in the beginning. He built everything he built without it. And when it finally came, in the most spectacular possible form, he discovered it didn't solve the problem he'd always been trying to solve. The question of whether he was enough. That question, it turns out, was never going to be answered by a Cy Young Award or a World Series ring or 59 consecutive scoreless innings. It was only going to be answered by the life he lived when all of that was finished, by the kind of person he chose to be in the silence. And by every account of the man, the answer to that question was yes. It was always yes. It just took him, and all of us, a very long time to see it. That is the story of Orel Hershiser. Not the version that fits on a trophy. The real one. The one that happened in the quiet, in the pain, in the persistence, in the long years before anyone knew his name, and the longer years after he left the field for the last time. A story about what it actually costs to endure. And why, when the final accounting is done, endurance matters more than almost anything else in the long run of a human life.